Okay, well, welcome everybody to this discussion. It's a strand of discussions called Science and Society. We're starting off this morning with the battle over birth. Our question for discussion, which our panellists are going to address with their views on it to start off with, should we stop having children? My name is Ellie Lee and I'm going to be chairing the discussion. I'm an academic at the University of Kent, where I am the director of a research centre called the Centre for Parent and Culture Studies. And we are delighted every year to be able to programme various discussions at this event. It's a great opportunity for us as a research centre to discuss questions which we're very interested in terms of issues affecting parents, families and so on. And obviously one that couldn't be more obviously central to all of that is whether we should be having children in the first place. It's obviously in some sense an old discussion. So for anybody that knows anything about the history of family planning, developments of contraceptive technologies and so on, part of that has always been influenced by a perception that at least certain people shouldn't be having children. And it may be that we want to discuss part of that history of concerns about people having children or who should be having them as part of what we're going to talk about. But really the impetus for having this particular discussion at this moment was really Blythe Pepino, who's one of the people on the panel. She's going to be speaking first because she has initiated a campaign called BirthStrike. And it was the news and reporting of BirthStrike and the arguments that she was making which made us think it would be good to have this discussion. Obviously, subsequent to that, we've heard from Prince Harry and his wife that they're not going to have any more children because of what they think about the environment and so on. So there's lots of news and discussion about this whole issue all the time. So I'm delighted to welcome Blythe. She's also a songwriter and singer, so I think is probably used to being on stages like this where you have very bright lights shining in your eyes, which makes it difficult to see the audience. But anyway, that's fortunate that she knows about that. So she's going first. Our second speaker is going to be Anne Furedi. Anne is the Chief Executive of British Pregnancy Advisory Service, which is Britain's main provider of abortion services to women in this country. And she's also the author of the book, The Moral Case for Abortion. So she's going second. Third, Alistair Currie. Delighted to welcome Alistair, who's the Head of Campaigns and Communications for Population Matters, which is a campaigning organisation, as the name suggests, concerned with population. Now, last, this is Ashley Frawley. Ashley is a sociologist from the University of Swansea with an interest in new social movements and the impulses behind new social movements. So I'm delighted that she's agreed to speak on the panel too. So Blythe, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here, firstly. So I think the first thing I want to say is to tackle the question a little bit. I have a little problem with the word should in the question because I think it immediately creates a sense of judgment. I'm basically incredibly pro-choice, so I don't really think that we should be asking the word should. So I'd quite like to reframe it as, is it okay to have kids? In terms of my slot and what I'm talking to you about. And I would talk about that in two ways. My time with BirthStrike and speaking to people in BirthStrike, and there's 600 of the people who signed up, and they've also sent in statements about why they're deciding not to have children in the face of ecological crisis. And I think that it's really important that people recognise there are two ways of looking at that question. Should we or should we not have kids, or is it okay to have kids? The first way that people approach it is what is the life of that child going to be like? So it's a sort of safety perspective way of looking at that question. And then the second way is more about our relationship to the world and our resources. So I'll go two-pronged, basically, to just try and break it down a little bit. So my answer to the first half of the question, as in, is it safe to have a child? What kind of a life would that child have in the face of ecological breakdown and potential civilization breakdown, as I see it, and as a lot of people see it in the BirthStrike community, is absolutely yes, it's fine to have kids. But what you need to recognise is they might not have a very long life. They might not have the kind of life that we expect, certainly in the developed and Western world, supposedly civilized world. They might go through a lot of stuff, basically. But I believe that everyone should have the choice to have kids, and I totally respect everyone who's still making the choice to have kids, even though they're fully aware of the ecological crisis and what kind of effects that could have on the child themselves. So secondly, the second half of the question, relationship to kind of population and a relationship to resources and consumption and our general overconsumption as a species, and the fact that we're using far more of our resources than we can or we should be. And my answer to that question is I also think it's still okay to have kids, and I'm dead against the idea that we would have like a general should not have kids, we should be having kids, societal view towards birth in that sense, because for several reasons. Firstly, I think that the idea of reducing birth rates as a fix for the environmental crisis is a bit of a moot point. Now, I don't think it's possible to do that. There's too many of us, and we're consuming far too quickly, and also the climate crisis is so bad, it's happening so quickly and it's developing so quickly that, there's a great study by PNAS on how a human population isn't really a fix for the crisis in that way. And there's a load of models that they put through that show all the different scenarios, whether it's something kind of horrific like a worldwide population control measure, one child kind of China thing, which obviously I'm dead against, down to sort of more slow ways of changing people's perceptions around birth and maybe trying to bring the birth rate down. None of that works. So it's kind of a moot point. It's also ethically problematic. I think that it would create a lot of stigma for especially people in the majority world, people, women, people of colour, people who are poor. I see it as a massive problem, even if you're talking about slight changes to the way that we look at birth, if we're trying to create that sort of general gist that, we should probably not have children or have less children. And I understand definitely the population is a factor in our resource issue, but I'm much more interested in overconsumption. I'm much more interested in systematic change and what we can do, which is probably a lot more, which definitely a lot more, if we were able to collectivise. So for me, the idea of focusing on birth as a fix for the climate crisis is kind of undermines what we can do as humans to change the crisis and to try and avert a lot of the crisis. If we collectivise, if we change the system that we're in, which forces us to overconsume, especially in the civilised world, then I think we've got a lot more of a chance to actually maybe stop extincting ourselves. I'm going through a lot of points here. Also, birth is not something that's often able to be controlled. I've met a lot of women who tried their hardest not to have kids and ended up getting pregnant and having that kid anyway. It's not always something that you can control, especially for people who don't have access to contraception, and that's why there would be potential issues with stigma and oppression of people who don't have access. What else? Systematic change, that's what I'm up for. So I'd rather it was a collective issue rather than focusing on all we can do as consumers is, we're constantly told like the biggest thing that we can do as individuals within the system is to stop having kids, because apparently that's the most we can do. I disagree with that. 100 of us could shut down a coal mine for a day, and that would prevent the same amount that you would save supposedly in a year from not having a kid. So okay. That's my story.
All right, thanks. Anne.
Thanks for inviting me to address this. I often feel as though I'm sometimes a little bit behind the curve in looking at some of these new social movements, and I have to confess that the first time that I came across the BirthStrike argument was when I was involved in making a film that's actually being shown later on today. Big plug, come along to the session at 4 o'clock for the film on the value of life. And this was a series of lectures that I put together with John O'Brien. It was some discussion that was filmed in front of an audience in Amsterdam, a genuine student audience. And at lunchtime, at the lunch break, one of the students asked if he could have a chat with me because he'd heard that I'd written this book, The Moral Case for Abortion. And we just had the saddest conversation that I can remember having with a really bright guy in his early 20s who came up to me and said, did I think it was really bad that he wanted to have a family because his friends had told him that it was morally wrong to have children? And what did I think about that? And we had a really good conversation with it where, I was really trying to explore with him why anyone could possibly think that it would be in somehow bad or immoral for him to have a child when our children, whichever way we look at it, are the future. They are the path that we have into doing things going forward, and the ambition to continue our values and to continue our lives into the future seems to me to be a very natural and a very good thing to do. And I explained to him that although I'd written a book called The Moral Case for Abortion, I could easily write one in the same take called The Moral Case to Have Babies. And in fact, while BPAS is, as Ellie says at the moment, an abortion provider, we are going to be starting up by the end of next year our first non-for-profit infertility clinic, because it's all about choice. It's all about enabling people to make decisions for themselves. And the reason why we want people to be able to make decisions for themselves is because we actually think that human quality of deciding, of taking control of your future, and indeed through that, the future of humanity is a really good thing. So I'm bothered by the BirthStrike movement. I'm bothered about it because I think that it's a bit misanthropic. I think it sees people as a problem. I think it's incredibly pessimistic about humanity and what we can do, but mainly because there are two main points that I want to throw out for consideration. The first one, and again, this confuses people given that I spend my life facilitating abortions for people, is that I have an enormous presumption in favour of life. I actually think having children is a really good thing. I think bringing new life into the world, raising new people like us, is an enormously good thing. And I also confess to a large degree of speciesism. I am really pro-humanity. I think we matter. I think the contribution that we bring, the development that we bring, what we are, really, really matters. And I think it's horrific to see people and to see children in terms of what they consume. The sort of notion that we measure up what the carbon footprint of a child or a person should be, or what its sort of weight of carbon emissions should be, rather than what it can contribute to the world, is pretty grim. And that's not really a view that I really want to hold. So the first thing is I've got a presumption in favour of life and human life in particular. But the second point that I want to throw out for consideration is also something to do with the personal is political, and a kind of breakdown between a world which formerly we've regarded as a private world, an intimate world of ourselves and decisions that we make, and what politics is. And we had a discussion on it yesterday in this very room, in fact. And I think to a large extent, we feminists are partly responsible for this sort of notion that the personal is political. And there's an element of truth in it, but when Susie Orbach wrote Fat is a Feminist Issue, which was one of the very early expressions of this in 1978, what she meant was that diet and the way that we look is influenced by the political and social circumstances that we're in. She didn't mean you have to be fat to be a feminist. That's not what she was coming from. It wasn't kind of living your life according to a particular thing. And I think that it's very important that we see that the personal decisions and the way that we present ourselves in the world and the decisions that we make about our family and our intimacies, whether we have children, who we marry, for heaven's sake, is not necessarily expressivist of political viewpoints and arguments that we might have out in the world. The fact that I've been married for more than 35 years to a white Jewish guy does not mean that I am that I am a racist in that I chose to marry a white guy rather than a black guy. The fact that my husband happens to be Jewish says nothing about how I feel about anti-Semitism or pro-Zionism. It's simply a personal decision that I took. And I spend a lot of time in my job arguing that when women come to us for abortion care, they do not come to an abortion clinic to exercise their reproductive rights, to exercise their right to abortion, like you exercise your right to vote. They don't come to us to express their view about whether abortion is right or wrong, or whether it's right or wrong to have a child. They come to us because they're dealing with something in their personal lives. And that is separate. We see women for abortions who, frankly, will tell us that they are absolutely anti-abortion and anti-choice. They think that abortion is wrong, but in their circumstances, they think it's wrong in principle, but in their circumstances, they absolutely feel that they need to go down that route. Now, are they being hypocritical? Is it hypocritical to not live your politics? Actually, I think we need, in society as it is at the moment, to be untangling a personal sphere where we live our lives according to our personal, individual ways in which we want to relate to each other intimately. And that involves the way that we relate to our children. And politics, which is about changing the world. And I'd like to see people bringing children into the world because they are the vehicle for which the future is going to be changed. And if we have no children, we absolutely have no future. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Alistair.
Before I start, could I just ask, could everyone in the audience who's a parent put their hand up, and indeed on the panel? Okay, not very many of us, actually. I'm a parent, and first of all, I'd just like to say I absolutely agree with Blythe, this question about should, and let's try and divorce looking at the issues that surround childbirth with judgment. I think, just like Blythe, like I hope all of us here, we're not here to judge the choices that people make. That doesn't mean that there aren't potentially choices which can have better effects than others. So I'm a father, and I'm going to answer the question as a father. I've got a 9-year-old son, and 10 years ago when my wife and I were thinking about having children, at that point I was working for an animal rights organisation, and my business was alternatives to regulatory toxicology tests in animals. And we decided to go ahead and have a child in the way that most people do. We've been married for a little while, we both wanted kids. 3 years ago, I went to work at Population Matters, which fundamentally is an environmental organisation. We look at one aspect of environmental problems, with fundamentally an environmental organisation. And over the last 3 years, across my desk for 3 years, has come more and more information about our environmental crisis. I say to you honestly, if I was making that decision now, I'm not sure I'd make the same one. I fear for my son's future. I really fear for my son's future. Hopefully, he's going to be around until the end of this century. I am certain that my son will have a less easy life than I've had. I think the worst case scenario for my son is one I don't even want to think about. And I don't say this because I'm anti-human or I'm by nature a pessimist. I say that my position on this comes from having learned about what's going on in our world. I have changed as a result of what I do, of the things that I've learned and what I've seen. I also, as a parent, parenting is, and Anne touched on this, it's an optimistic choice. It's a choice about the future. It's about how you think about the future. And if you're going to be a parent, you want to picture that better future, and you want to imagine how your child might contribute to that better future. So what I'm focused on, what I think about, is the ways in which we can avert what is coming our way, unless we do that, unless we make those choices. And I think it's very important when we're talking about this issue, and sort of Blythe touched on it, and Anne did as well. Let's not be binary in this. Okay, it is not a choice between addressing population and childbirth and tackling consumption or climate change or individual choice or any of these other areas. The IPCC not the IPCC, a member of the IPCC, when they launched their very concerning 1.5 degree report last year, said, this isn't a question of what we do and what we choose to do. Said, we're in a situation now where nothing can be left off the table, where we have to do what we can do in order to avert what's coming. Population Matters addresses population, about the number of us. The number of us on this planet is not the thing which determines our future. And again, I agree with Blythe entirely on this. It's what we do, and it's how we consume and the choices that we make. But each one of us, my son included, who I love, needs land, food, water, infrastructure, energy. Each one of us produces waste of one kind or another, pollution, climate emissions. I can love my son, and I can love human beings and be pro-human being, and recognise that those two things coexist, that my son, that all of us here have a negative effect on the environment, and that human beings are a good thing. There's nothing anti-human or anti-natalist about our position. As one of the people connected my organisation says, I love babies, and you can have too much of a good thing. And that really nails it down. I love dogs, and I love my dog. I wouldn't want 20 of them in my house. It doesn't mean anything about what you feel about human beings and their potential. I think the potential of human beings is phenomenal and almost infinite. But to use the words of our patron today, David Attenborough, paraphrasing, there's no environmental problem that wouldn't be easier to solve with fewer people and harder to solve with more people. And that's essentially true. And I think intuitively, we all know that. If you think about the world, we're at 7.7 billion now. The population has more than doubled in my lifetime, all those people. And I think we will talk about inequality, which is really important, and I'm sure we'll touch on this later on. Not that all those people are making an impact in the same way. It's particularly incumbent on those of us who are making a huge impact in a place like this to think about our choices, which includes the size of our families.
Ashley.
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting about this discussion is, it's actually a really good discussion to have because it brings together so many different threads that I think are really common in the way we think about social problems now, the way we think about social movements. But one thing that I want to focus on is how very old ideas that have been around for a long time and with a really dangerous history, are being rehashed in a really kindly, therapeutic, voluntaristic kind of language. So the argument that you were saying, so is it okay versus should? It's not that I'm saying you should do this. We should think about whether or not it's okay, because life isn't going to be quite so great. We may not live the life that we expect in the West. Well, I could make that argument about whether or not it's okay to have kids when you're poor. Right? Like, we know that poor people, there are health inequalities, and poor people don't live as long. Is it okay to bring children into the world if you're poor? And people make that argument. They actually say that. And I think that what's happening is when I was so that's a really bad idea. Like, we've just come out of, in the 20th century, really negative repercussions of having that kind of idea. Sterilizing people. Like, people were actually saying, to solve social problems, we need to sterilize disabled people. We should sterilize all these different people. And then, of course, it went down a horrific kind of route. But we're recasting these ideas, not these exact ideas, but very similar kinds of ideas through therapeutic and voluntaristic language. And as I was sort of thinking about what I was going to say today, I was kind of joking around and wondering, is there any limit to which we can recast these bad ideas of the past through kindly language. And I was thinking like voluntary euthanasia, right? So older people, you recognize that it is, there's a lot of you, and it's quite hard for young people today to work and have your taxes be paying to take care of you. Should you not, just kind of, volunteer? I'm not saying you should. Should you not volunteer to be euthanized? Don't you think that that would be a good... I'm not saying you should. And I was joking about this, and then I realized, this is actually happening. In Canada, where there's, there was a case where a man with very profound disabilities was asking for assisted living, and the health professionals kept implying, because it would be very expensive, he had very profound disabilities, and he wanted to live in the community. And they were basically implying, but we have euthanasia, and that is an option. And they kept pushing, and he felt like he was being pushed into voluntary euthanasia. And the headlines in the newspapers were, man offered assisted dying instead of assisted living. Sterilizing Indigenous women in Canada. So there's a court case right now. Up until 2017, Indigenous women were being sterilized. So when they were having C-sections, at that point, they were being pushed into voluntarily sterilizing themselves or being sterilized. And I can guarantee that is not part of a conscious eugenic program, but more like, well, these women are very poor. A lot of them have substance abuse issues. Wouldn't it be best if you sterilized yourself? Wouldn't it be? And they're like open on an operating table, pressured into this. And I found it, or like women being emotional and irrational. So that's like an old, really like negative idea. And I actually routinely get manuscripts. So I'm on the editorial board for Zero Books. And it'll be like, if only we could put women in positions of power, because women are ruled by their emotions and they're closer to nature. But I mean, this is a good thing, which was in the past a very damaging and insulting idea of women that kept them out of public life. But now it's like, no, ladies, I mean, this is a good thing. So we're sort of rehashing these old damaging ideas in ways that sound really nice. And and in some ways, this has always been the case, because obviously, people who, during colonialism, people who went on civilizing missions, they truly felt that they were doing good things, and they definitely communicated what they were doing in very nice language. But I think what's interesting now is that there's nothing really fighting against these ideas. We've got a situation where if something sounds good, well, it just must be, right? So as the left and right have been untethered from their sort of economic bases, their traditional bases of support, it becomes the left is like nice people who care about people, and the right is these mean people. So if you're like a little rough around the edges, you're alt-right. And if you're a nice person, you're left. So then if an idea is cast in these really nice sounding ways, it's very disarming, and it becomes very difficult to fight against these ideas. It strikes me that we aren't actually rejecting these old bad ideas, we're just changing the sources of them. So censorship, is it bad when the state does it, or is it just bad in general? Some people go, no, it's fine, it's not censorship because a corporation is doing it. Or it's not bad because I censor myself, right? So what's interesting is that the source of the coercion is moved inside our heads. And that's the way that power now exists. It's not enacted from the outside. It's not a coercive, China, the state, telling you, you must do this. Now it's like you are invited to police yourself. And it's not so bad because I'm doing it to myself, right? So I see this with loads of different movements, like medicalization. People would reject that. Don't tell me my experiences are medical problems. They're structural problems and that sort of thing. And it's moved to, how dare you doctors medicalize me? I will medicalize myself, thank you very much. I have self-diagnosed, and so it's actually become much more insidious because it's much harder to fight against because it sounds so good, but also you can't name a common enemy. You can't name the enemy. Who is it? It's you. It's yourself. You are the only barrier to the wonderful future that lays in front of you. You punish yourself. Look at in Canada, there was a climate march. Trudeau was out with them. And that's so disorienting. You're like, well, who am I even fighting against here? I have no idea. And so a lot of these movements will use the language of decolonization But it actually might be a form of what we call deep colonization, or what Yang Ji, a Chinese sociologist, calls kindly power. Power enacted through a kindly language intended to bring people on side. And this makes it much more insidious and harder to fight against because it's disarming. And it makes it very, very difficult to see, when it sounds so good, why we should be fighting against it. But these are old ideas. These are ideas that brought us down a very bad path in the past. And we need to bring forward an idea of human action that is very positive, because that is the only way that we can solve the problems. The only things that can solve the problems on this planet are us, human beings, the human beings that will be born, the human beings that are alive now.
Okay, thank you. Should we thank our panel? I think what I'm going to do actually is just come straight out to you. I think we've got there are some pretty clear lines on the panel here, I think, 2 and 2. And I mean, some pretty big discussions to be had here around whether you're both actually encouraging kindly power and ultimately coercion and control and misanthropy.
Yeah.
And whether any of this should ever be made the subject of personal life. And then the wider set of issues around the status of population as part of what we think about development, economy, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, masses for us to discuss. So I'm going to come straight out.
Thank you. I just wanted to address this normative question, should people stop having children versus is it okay to have children? Because, I mean, I do think it matters. And it seems to me to kind of speak to some of the weird ways in which the kind of language of reproductive choice has morphed over the past few decades. Because to me, that idea of pro-choice meant that society, culture, the state, whatever, shouldn't kind of force women to do something with their bodies or make decisions that they otherwise wouldn't make. And that's why we have legal access to abortion and everything else. What we seem to have now in a lot of the kind of pro-choice language is this sort of idea of, actually, we really don't have a view as a society about whether it's a good thing to have kids or not. It's okay. So if you're going to have kids, it's on your head, be it, right? It's your individual choice. It's your individual responsibility. And as a parent, you make that choice and you should kind of cope with consequences. And you get this sort of coming out quite a lot in terms of sort of parenting culture, where people do describe this very individuated experience of having children now, where no one's saying, oh, it's a bad thing to do, but it's sort of outside the wider context that this is a good thing to do as a society. So I think it's perfectly possible to, as a society, and it is right, to say, it is a good thing for societies to reproduce, to replace themselves, to have children, to build the future. That doesn't mean that all women should have children. Individual women can make those choices, but they can make choices not to. But in a kind of optimistic context where it is seen as this is the right thing to do. And I think, actually, I kind of agree with what you were saying about this, this kind of power domination and the problems of sort of the therapeutic language around this. But I also think that policy trajectories and various kind of economic trends at the moment are actually exercising quite a lot of influence in framing people's sort of decision, that basically encourage people to think that actually having kids is too much of a risk worth taking, too much of a difficult thing to do, and it's actually making it very difficult for people to make that individual decision about it's good to have a family.
Right, I agree with Anne that this is very much, it should be a very much a personal issue. I wonder what the panel thinks then of the criticism or shaming of people who choose not to have children. Because I think we just seem to have a problem with choice of any kind, and we should just mind our own business. So I see articles every day about how single, educated, middle-class women are choosing to be child-free and how selfish that is, and so on. I mean, should we just butt out people's life choices?
Obviously, because a lot of people that are in, most people that are in same-gender relationships, if we're thinking cisgender people, can't conceive naturally. A question to Alistair, do you think that then that those people in same-gender relationships should, in a sense, take one for the team and just adopt and not conceive naturally? Because obviously people in different gender relationships sometimes can't as well. Do you think that those people should, in a sense, take one for the team and adopt and not have kids.
Question for Blythe. So you're saying we in the West shouldn't have children. So who should then? Is it people in other parts of the world who aren't Western and wealthy? I mean, who should be having children? Because surely we can't all just not have children.
Okay, I'm going to take some comments just coming along this way, if you want to.
Sure,
Anything you
yeah.
want to
I
respond
think
to?
probably I've been quite confusing because I tried to shove in far too many points in my first bit. So I'm definitely not saying that anyone should stop having children. What I'm saying is that there is a growing movement of people who are too afraid to have kids, and feel also that they may not want to contribute to the ongoing decline on the planet. So my position and the position of BirthStrike, which a lot of people get very confused, is that we're trying to coerce people or tell people not to have kids. That's not what we're doing. We don't think that population reduction is a fix for the climate crisis. What we are saying is that we are either too afraid or we need to go on the street and become activists, and we don't have time to have a child. At this point in time, the next 5 years is incredibly important in terms of the welfare of our species and whether or not we're going to exist past the end of the century. So for women like me, who I'm 33, and I'd quite like to have a kid with my partner. I love my partner and I really want him to be a dad. But my main reason is that I'm an activist now, and I'm probably going to put myself in a position where, I don't have time, basically, and I don't have the time to create the resources to create the life that I would want for the child as well. And there's plenty of people in BirthStrike who are also basically just too frightened, having done a lot of research into the climate crisis. So let me just get that straight. So I'm not telling anyone to not have kids, but I do think it's interesting that you thought that, and I'm sorry if I put my position out incorrectly. Also, I did say that we should change the question from should to is it okay, but actually that's not really what I meant. What I meant was the question should just be for ourselves to answer. And the question should just be, do I want a child? Inform yourselves about the climate crisis, figure out what you think. Do you think it's just not happening? Do you think it's not that bad? Do all the research that you can, look into all the different angles and make an informed choice. And that's pretty much everything that BirthStrike is saying. And yeah, on that last point as well, I do think population is a factor, but it shouldn't be the framework for our focus. And I don't think it can be a fix. And I think that's ethically problematic to come at it from that angle, but hopefully it would be a side product of systematic change, creating equality between us as a species, which would also be really good in terms of sharing, because we're going to lose a lot of our resources and there's going to be a lot of pressures on us as a species. So I'm really sorry, because I think you put forward a question that I can't really answer because that's not my view.
But by having an organisation called BirthStrike,
Yeah.
you're sort of suggesting...
Am I? That's really interesting though, isn't it?
By posing the question that we should all be thinking about our choices,
Yeah.
you're sort of kind of saying, well, think about your choices and don't have children.
That's what the media said that we were doing.
That's what it sounds like.
The words BirthStrike. That's what the words BirthStrike sounds to you.
And if I may, a strike sounds like something you do in order to create a change. And it's a temporary thing that you do in order to create a change. And when you have the change that you seek, then
a bus driver on strike doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't want to drive a bus.
Since you started, do you want to keep going with anything else
Yeah.
that you want to come back on? And there is a question.
Sorry, I mean,
that
Blythe, did you want to say anything?
Oh,
Well, I
no,
think-
carry on, sorry.
We need to move on a bit anyway, so you go now.
Okay. First of all, to answer your question that you had, the word we've had a few times here, which is a really important word, is choice. Everyone should be able to choose whether or not to have children. And so I'm very pleased to hear that BPAS is introducing infertility treatment, because people should have that choice. The world is not going to be saved, and the world shouldn't be saved by people who are forced into a situation where they can't have children, not having children. What we seek at Population Matters is that people choose to have fewer children where they can. An awful lot of people can't make that choice yet. So where this starts off from is empowerment. And the recipe for bringing fertility, which is, and fertility is, I'm speaking of fertility in the sort of statistical term rather than infertility as in the medical term. The recipe for bringing that down is well known. It's reducing poverty and also inequality. it's empowering women, it's ensuring everyone, especially girls, but everyone has high quality education. It's making sure not simply that people have access to modern contraception, because actually almost everyone does, but there are many other factors that prevent them from using it. And it's giving people the choice and explaining to them the reasons why having a smaller family might be a good thing. Those are the solutions, those are the things that bring down the number of children that people have. And bring down the number of children that people have is going to help and it's going to make a big difference. Now, again, just to amplify something that Blythe said there, having fewer children right now is not going to solve the climate crisis. Let's be absolutely clear about that. The IPCC said last year that we have 12 years to fix climate change broadly. That's what they said. Changes in fertility just now will make a difference. Any child that isn't born in the next 12 years won't be producing carbon in those 12 years, but it's not going to solve that problem. However, first of all, let's not think that climate change is going away. Choices that we make just now, and particularly when it comes to choices that we have about having kids, those are choices which have effects for literally generations, for decades, those choices. Having fewer people being born, emitting carbon is going to help address that problem in the long term. Secondly, I'm afraid to say the climate crisis is not our only crisis, not by a long way. The biodiversity crisis is every bit as scary. It doesn't get the attention, and climate change rightly has the attention. But I'm I'm old enough rather to remember when we used to talk about conservation. Now what we talk about is the sixth mass extinction. The things that drive extinction, the things that drive biodiversity loss, things like habitat loss, all those kinds of things. Almost all of them are driven by one of the factors that drives almost all of those is population growth, and the scientists all left that. It's not the only thing, and this is a really clear message I want. We can't solve the world's problems through addressing population. If we don't address population, if we don't address our numbers and find voluntary choice-based ways to bring them to a more sustainable level, we're not going to fix our environmental problems in the term. We need to do both. Let's not be binary about it.
Ashley, anything you like? I thought empowerment might be
Yeah, so empowerment, sharing, And I see this all the time, like, I'm not saying you should do this, but as a good person, just as a nice guy, you should do this, you should, but what you're actually saying, particularly with empowerment, is I give you the power to enact what I want you to do, right? So that's what empower, and when people don't enact that, they're bad. If people actually have like a bottom-up kind of way of doing things that is fundamentally challenging to that narrative that's given to them by the state or by NGOs or whatever it is, international development policy, whatever, then they are bad. So like. You want to empower. So there's another really good example of really bad ideas getting rehashed in therapeutic language. So we want to empower communities in Africa. So I was joking, and then I realized this is literally international development policy. So they say cultural continuity is so important to people. It's such an important part, particularly in Africa. What's happening is so many people have left. And then you've got these communities in the UK, for instance, that are really cut off from their homes. And so we want to just try to go and encourage people to have this social cohesion and community within African villages so that they don't feel the need to leave, which is a wonderful therapeutic way of saying Africans should go home. But that is literally what people are saying. They think of, so if you have aspirations, you want to move, if you want to leave your squalid existence and you get into a rickety little boat and go across the water to try to get to the EU, that's the bad kind of having power and deciding how you're going to live your life. We want to empower you to enact what we think you should do that works for our societies. So I think what's scary about this, again, is that I actually prefer the old kind of coercion, because at least when you had a policeman beating your head, your mind was still, it might be damaged physically, but your mind was still yours, Now the coercion is total, because it's coming from you, it's coming from within. So it's very hard to fight against that. I'd actually prefer the outside coercion, because then I know you are the enemy, I'm gonna fight against you. Now when I control myself, who's the enemy? Me, for what I did and what I chose.
Right. Anne.
A couple of things. First of all, in response to the question over there, I would absolutely support any non-cisgendered people seeking fertility treatment at any clinic that we're running, for sure. I definitely don't think people should be singled out to take one for the team. Small point on, I don't think we should get too much into the semantics of the word strike with this. It's one of those words, isn't it, that you can use to mean a whole load of things. I have to confess, being a bit sad, one of my favourite TV programmes is Strike Force, which involves a lot of hot Navy SEALs of both genders and all genders running around, blowing things up. Oh, and there's a really cool dog in it as well, blowing things up in defence of Western civilization. I don't think they're seeing it as a temporary thing. I think they're seeing strike as a means of fighting back. So, I think there are lots of ways in which we can look at the word strike. What I am really now more freaked out about than ever is the doomsday scenario that you guys are presenting in terms of what you think the future is going to be like. And the response that we have to this, because I don't really have time to get into, big debate about how bad the climate crisis is. And I don't really know all that much about it. But just putting it to one side, even if I assume that the climate crisis is as bad as you think it is, right?
Not me, scientists.
Well, right. Even if I assume, right, that we are hurtling towards total doomsday by the time that your son has grown up, there's still a kind of thing in my mind about what I do about that, which is, and what I think can make a difference to it. So when I think about the new generation of people who are going to be born, I really genuinely do see them as being the problem solvers. I see them as being the brains and minds that can really develop the solutions to the problems that we have. And that's why, that clearly doesn't translate into have as many children as you can have, folks, because among there will be, another science genius, because but there is definitely a thing in saying we can either respond to the social problems that we've got by saying humanity has no ability to deal with it, or humanity has every ability to deal with it. And I like to look on the optimistic side of it. Frankly, David Attenborough's point about how the climate problems will be solved will depend on how many people. It's easier to solve them if there are fewer people than there are if there are more people. I absolutely would bet my year's salary that Attenborough thinks that the world is a better place because he is in it. He doesn't think that he is one of the people who shouldn't have been born as a contribution to all of this. I just think that we should really think quite carefully what it means when we say we can't address the problems that we've got going forward.
Okay. Can I just say quickly on that? We are not saying we can't address the problems. We're not saying that's flightless. What we're saying is how severe the problems are. And just to respond to that point, if anyone imagines that 7.7 billion brains on this planet aren't enough to solve our problems, then there is no hope for us.
Yeah, I also have a son, and I'm on balance fairly certain that his life will be better than mine. And I think my grandson will also live to a ripe old age, because statistically, projecting forward, that's what's likely to happen. And I think the real problem is that we have a very different vision of the relationship between the present and the future. And it seems to me that human history has shown us time and again that there are moments when we think that this is it. Around the year 1000, people were, as we went into the 11th century, they were kind of looking around waiting for the world to end. They thought that was it, there was no solution to it. And I think, in general, human beings have had a fairly good capacity to solve problems. And it seems to me that, we have to ask ourselves, do we go down the road of imagining this worst-case scenario, extinction happening, and I'm so worried about my child, which is one way of looking at it, or do we actually think that we have some problems that we need to tackle, and on balance, if we do what humans have always done, we'll find a solution to it. And I think what really worries me is that we're now going down the road of two different languages, we're now going down the road of two different visions, and some people in the West are literally pissing in their pants, and they're becoming so worried that they are almost paralyzing themselves and the younger generations by framing the future in such negative, destructive way. Whereas in other parts of the world, I just been to Asia recently, people say to me, do you guys really believe what you're saying? They just find it incomprehensible that we lost confidence in our capacity as human beings. So we're virtually seeing everything in this kind of very black and white negative terms. And I think that as adults, we have a responsibility to actually give children and young people the confidence to work as problem solvers, to believe in their capacity to transform the world for have a better future, than to kind of give them this constant diet of scare stories, which actually, sort of, when push comes to shove, will prove to be, sort of limited significance, because we will find these answers. And I think we've got to believe in our children rather than imagine and worry about them, because they will teach us many very important lessons.
Okay, next to you, and then behind you.
I've been talking and reading about this with young people. And one of the things that strikes me is that I don't think that when people think about whether they have children or not, whether they are thinking of it in terms of solving problems. I think that it's much more about whether that's something that you want to do. And what really strikes me is that I don't think that there are that amongst the younger people that there is a desire to have kids, or that they can necessarily imagine themselves having kids very easily. So if you look at the reasons that people give when they talk about whether they would have kids or not, or more particularly why they don't want to have kids, you get answers like, well, it's kind of expensive, and it would be a cramp to my lifestyle. And it's so interesting because it's like socialization and bringing forward the next generation is about making us want to do what we have to do to survive. And right now, we don't want to do what we need to do to survive. And why do you think it is that that's changed? Or, maybe I'm wrong. I'd like to hear what the panel has to say about that.
So first of all, and Furedi, I think your point about choice was really, really interesting and very true, because in my opinion, feminism is all about the choice that women have to decide what their lives are going to be. And that is the message that is very heavily not pushed around, but shown in countries like the UK and the US. But I think that there is a bigger issue in that message isn't carried across overseas. And so there are countries in different continents which are less developed, and they don't have the access that they need to sex education and contraception. And they need that because they should be allowed to make the choice that they should have kids. But because they don't have that contraception, they don't have that sex education, they don't know the impact of what their choice is. So they can't decide for themselves what it needs to be. And it should be that way. They should get to make the choice. Because A, I guess in many ways that would help the population problem. And B, it's also just a fact. Women should get to choose no matter what, because everyone should get to choose. That's our right as a human being. And I guess the question I just wanted to ask the panel in general is, what do you think about that bigger issue of taking the message overseas first?
Okay, I'm sure we can come back to that on international family planning.
I just wanted to address something that Anne said, which was about it really reminds me of Brexit so much, and I hate to draw the parallel between, I speak to Brexiteers and they say, we're gonna, all the empiricism and all the facts and shit, and they point to, really bad stuff happening when Brexit actually goes down, if it does. But somehow these Brexiteers have this, really romanticised idea about how the young people are so creative and they're gonna fix it, and, it drives me kind of crazy, because I don't think it's just, I'm 22, And like, it's not just my responsibility. Like, I'm creative as hell as well, but like, there's only so much I can do. like I could. When I hear that we're heading towards some kind of catastrophe in the environment in 12 years, I'm going to be 34 years old. If that's when it's kicking in, like, other than taking control of my personal life and like not having a car, not having kids, being vegan, not buying all the things that come in plastic, I don't know what you expect us to do. We need it to come from higher up. Like, young people are amazing and creative, but there's only a certain amount we can do if it's not coming from all of you as well, because you have more power than us right now.
Following on from you, actually, because I'm 32, so when I was in my second year at school, about 25 years ago now, someone came in to talk to us about the environment, and he gave us quite a scary talk about the environment and that things weren't going very well. And then at the end, he finished it, he pointed like a finger at this class, and he was like, and it's going to be you and your generation that are going to have to make the decisions, and they're going to have to deal with this and change this. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I'm 7. I really remember sitting there being like, why are you pointing at me? Like, and I think that several generations have been told it's going to be you. Let's not be like, our children are the ones that are going to be the problem solvers. Like, I mean, I've listened to all of your arguments, and I really don't know almost where I stand in terms of having children around this, but I'm like, if we see having children in the future is the way we're going to solve crises that are crises now, that's putting a huge burden on them. You're feeling that burden now, like 10 years younger than I am. And I remember feeling it then when I was 7, being like, I'm 7. So I think that saying, okay, so let's see the children as a way out of this. And I know that's not exactly what you're saying, but having that is something that it just suddenly popped that memory up into my mind, and I just think actually through our choices, whatever choices you make and however you choose to make them, we need to be making them now and in the past almost, basically.
Can I just ask you, do you think people can solve problems? I mean, if it's not, or where do you stand on this view about it just all seeming so big and impossible to do much about other than not have children and pull back? Or do you think problems can be solved by people doing things?
Well, I think they have to be solved by people, because I don't think there's anyone, it has to be solved by people, right? If it's going to be solved. I mean, I don't really know. I guess that I would be, like Blythe would say, everyone should be free to make their own choice. I appreciate that there's a lot of pressure, and we are being given quite a stressful set of ideas that we feel like we should be following. And it is stressful. Like, I'm 32, I have no idea if I'm going to have children, if I should have children, whether or not I can economically have them, whether or not it's a good idea. And like, I really think about it, like I think about it every day. And I don't know, I have no answer. And it is depressing. I think a lot of people feel sad. But I kind of see what you're all saying at the same time. Like, I think you can't. It's if we all get really depressed and are like, right, we can't have children, we can't enjoy anything. We've got to focus on the fact that we're probably all going to die. No one wants to live like that for the rest of their lives. Like, and we're not going to solve the problems if we live like that for the rest of our lives, because we're all going to be so depressed, we're not going to get out of bed and do anything. But then at the same time, I think like to also take responsibility and try and face up to the fact that big things that could have really long-term impacts, and we have to think about that, and we have to try and find solutions. So I don't really know the answer.
Hi there, thanks for all your points of view. I'm frustrated in a sense because I feel like probably Boris Johnson's fault, but we've fallen into a bit of a political trap. We're talking about children, which is a biology question, and we're not talking about kind of altruism and free will, and we're talking about a choice question. We're not talking about those aspects of what compels people to have children from the very beginning. This is reproduction has existed before we knew we existed. So I think those kind of things are relevant. Plus, I think it's important to acknowledge that we're living in, the red island in the blue sea in terms of Brexit, in terms of being rich, in terms of all those factors. And we know that as people get richer and more educated, the birth rate falls off a cliff. So I guess I just want to have a more kind of, all the points are relevant in terms of personal choice, the libertarian argument, climate change, all those things are relevant and important. I just think we need to really expand it out, and I'm curious to what all you think about having bigger biological, future-focused questions like, let's analyse, is free will real? Is altruism real? Is the natural fallacy something that's driving how we have kids and why?
So they're not very difficult questions there then. I'm going to take a couple down here, then I'm going to come to the front for quick comments, not big speeches, and then we've got time for one more lot.
So I would give more credibility to the movement of BirthStrike and see it less of an act of virtue signaling if our population rate in the UK wasn't what it is. So the birth rate in the UK is what, like 1.2, So we've already seen the effects of like us having less children and being able to provide for the aging population and the NHS. Contrastingly, in other parts of the world, the birth rate is much higher, upwards of 7 to 10 children, So likewise, if you look at greenhouse gases and emissions, what we contribute in the West is far less than compared to countries like India and China.
That's not true.
My question is, why do you think us having less children in the West will actually contribute an effect to combating climate change and birth rates in other countries? And would you advocate that non-Western people should not have children?
I have 4 daughters, so I think I'm the worst person in the room. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure if they will be problem solvers. They are not interested in solving any problem at the moment. They are troublemakers. But what I'm asking myself, what is the role of a parent here, of an adult? How should we behave? And I'm quite shocked of the vocabulary that's raised here. Because, growing up is a hard time. There's a lot of insecurities, a lot of thinking about what is my role. And it's the first time that I hear the social movement is saying, okay, you as a kid, as your pure existence is a problem. It's a problem that you are here, and well, we can make something about it. But and I don't think that you will get old. I think you will die soon because the world is coming to an end. I think this is the worst thing you can say to a kid as a parent. And I think even if I'm not sure that everything will be nice and we will solve the problems, my role is to make strong kids, to give them a positive view on the future.
Anne, do you want to start?
Just to address one thing, and I'll maybe come back on some other things later. I get the point about not saying we're all burnt out, we're going to hand over the problem to the next generation. I get that. People have been doing their age thing. I'm nearly 60, and believe me, I feel I'm still pretty creative, and I've got quite a lot of changes and so on that I want to bring into the world. I think what we're really trying to get at is the way and the point was made at the front about how you can see a problem and then you can determine how you're going to respond to it. And the most shocking experience that I've ever had, I think, was going to Singapore, spending a week in Singapore, which is a very small, almost city-state country with no natural water supply. And they're really worried about their population there because they don't feel they have enough people there to be able to generate the value that they think that they can do. They've got a water problem, so consequently they're investing in a massive desalinization of the sea, of the ocean, to give them the fresh water. They're doing a shed load of stuff on humidity and on virtual farming and on underground living to enable society to grow and develop using new technologies and stuff. And I think that's what I'm saying when I think we can be futuristically looking to solutions rather than just imagining we're not capable of dealing with it. I think, you'd kind of at least want to try, wouldn't you? Rather than just give up.
No one is saying give up. The most important point here is that we already know how to fix this. Our environmental problems are solvable today if we do so. So we're not looking for tech fixes in the future. I mean, the reality is actually when it comes to dealing with climate change, we are going to need some tech fixes in the future, but we've got enough people to create those already. But just to talk about, there's lots of changes we need, system change. You read environmental reports, significant environmental reports, like I do as part of my job. One word comes up over and over and over and over again, and that's transformation. It says we need to transform the way that we do things. What we're not going to do is sit around waiting for some sort of technical fix for this. With all due respect, I think what we've mostly heard from Anne and Ashley today is theory. What we've mostly heard here is the notions of how things might be, or how things were bad in the past, or what the consequences of something might be. Let's talk practical. Let's talk about how we fix things. And sir, I do not tell my child he's a carbon emitter and that he's going to burn to death in a little while. After we've done this, I'm going to watch the Shaun the Sheep movie with him, and I'm going to encourage him to be positive and happy as he is and contribute what he can to the world. I'm saying what I said about his future and our future to you as adults. It is not being negative, as I said before, to recognise the negative side of this. But I'm here to talk about population. That's my job. But before that, we need to understand we can fix our environment now. We must fix our environment now. And frankly, any discussion, and again, with all due respect to Anne, that implies that we're not in an environmental crisis is grossly irresponsible and is going to lead to a great deal of suffering. I don't think that the human race is going to become extinct. I think humans are incredibly resourceful, and I think at the end of the world, it'll just be us and the cockroaches left. And I'm glad that I'm on us side, on the human side, not the cockroaches side. I don't think we're going to go extinct anytime soon. But we have to change our world rapidly and quickly. If we don't address population, then we're storing up trouble for ourselves in the future, and it will make people's lives better now. But that's my key message. Fix it now. We can fix it now.
Yeah, so to you, I would say have kids. They're great. Their purpose is not to solve problems. They're wonderful. You watch them grow, and it's amazing. They enrich your life, and their purpose is within themselves. I think that the point, there's a ton of discussion in society that sees children basically as solutions to social problems. So we go into family life and we try to get people, we turn raising children into a series of techniques designed to solve this or that social problem. It sucks all the joy out of it. So you have to differentiate between what we're saying, which is a corrective to this idea of he's a carbon emitter. I know it's a sad thing to say, but each child that's born is at least one less, disgusting little mouth to feed. No, I'm kidding. I'm being flippant. Okay, so it's a corrective to this tendency to see the human footprint in a profoundly negative way. So we say, look, human beings are not just mouths to feed. They are hands that can work, minds that can think, and so on. But that is different than saying they will solve the problems. It's just a corrective to that. And I think it's actually very, very important to see children as ends in themselves, right? Instead of seeing them as solutions. So it's if you fall too far on one side, you're creating a problem. But I think what's the issue here is that we're being invited to panic. And one of the reasons why I think this discourse is dangerous is because it deflects attention from actually thinking about the problem itself. So we have a conversation about choice, whether or not it's okay to have children and so on, rather than is that analysis of the problem actually correct? Is that why we have climate issues? Is it because there are too many people on the planet? No, absolutely not. We don't live in a direct relationship as human beings with nature, with the ends that we would put up. And so instead of thinking about that, instead of thinking rationally about how we actually solve these problems, we're invited to panic. Right? And I can give you a whole list of really bad social policies that are constructed on the basis of panic. It's never a good idea to do that. We have to step back and think rationally. But instead, we're all, that's it, the world is ending, and the question is, is it okay to bring children into this catastrophe? That is not a good way to solve problems.
Blythe?
So I think actually a lot of us have a lot of points that cross over, and I don't think we're actually at odds in as many ways as we're sort of being framed as. Collective action, being being realistic about the situation that we're in doesn't necessarily mean being depressed. It doesn't necessarily mean being overly negative. Those are values that are being put on it. I would say that it's potentially incredibly positive. If you want to give it a negative or positive spin, then it's incredibly necessary. It's potentially very positive for us to realistically look at what's happening and then look for solutions. Obviously, I'm not pitting that birth rate reduction is going to be a solution necessarily. It might be a small way, but I don't think it's going to be a solution to the climate crisis or whatever's happening. But I do think it's just very interesting. This whole conversation is really interesting because the whole time I created BirthStrike, I've basically been saying, I'm not judging people. We're not judging people. We're just saying what we're doing. And we're trying to communicate to people how the situation that we're in terms of our species. It feels like there's a lot of differences in the room in terms of how people are viewing the climate crisis and whether it's really that much of an issue or not. I think maybe we just need to go and inform ourselves about what's really happening. But I would say to you two ladies who stood up in the middle and you talked about a lot of the stuff that I've been really struggling with, you know, whose responsibility is this, and like putting it all on myself. It's a collective. We need to work on this as a collective. We need collective action. And one of the problems with, and potentially the problem with BirthStrike, especially as the way it's been sort of put out in the media, and means that a lot of people consider it to be that we're trying to coerce people to not have kids, and we're blaming population for the to be as part of the issue, is that people are constantly dissuaded from seeing ourselves as political agitators. And actually what we really need is to address the consumption issue. And we're over-consuming, and the top 10% people who, top 10% of, what am I trying to say? Top 10% wealthy people in the world are contributing 70% to that problem. And so we have a huge issue, which is overconsumption and inequality. And those are the two things I'd prefer us to be really talking about. But for BirthStrike, it was a way of getting that conversation into places like mainstream media that are immediately alarmed and interested by the topic of reproduction, because they just want to talk about that. Whereas, like last year, no one really wanted to talk about the climate crisis at all. It was a don't touch it with a barge pole issue. So it did help to get it out there. But ultimately, what I would say to everyone is get your boots on and start attacking the system, because it's the system that's the problem. We are forced to consume, to overconsume, and it's part of the way that the system works. Okay. So, yeah, get political rather than focusing on it as an individual passive.
Okay, I'll take everyone I can who still wants to speak.
I think that BirthStrike, by being an activist kind of group or a movement, takes a personal decision and makes it a group moral kind of decision. You create a tribe for someone to join. And rightly or wrongly, activism and environmentalism are cool now. They're things that young people think are a cool thing to kind of be involved in. And BirthStrike might be just an easy way to kind of act on that. And it takes that personal agency of a real personal decision about whether to bring a life into the world and makes it a kind of an act of activism, which I kind of am tense with. I tend to agree with Frank that the world will be a lot better for our children and grandchildren. That has been the trajectory of travel for the last number of years, and we've exponentially, as technology has improved, we've exponentially improved the quality of life, and poverty is lowering at a rapid rate. But I'll play devil's advocate and imagine if my children in the future, if the world is going to be as bad as the doomsdayers say, right? I don't think that's the only measure of a human life. There's human beings, not human doings, right? They experience a range of conscious experiences in a lifetime. Man's Search for Meaning was one of the most inspiring books ever, and he found meaning in his life even though it was incredibly full of hardship. Mm. In that lifetime, even if it is the end of the world, that person might fall in love, might have so many positive conscious experiences that wouldn't exist otherwise. On the topic of what's driving women to not want...
Yeah, I think that, yeah. Just one point, anybody.
Thanks. I'm sorry, but I do find that there's a lot of disingenuous discussion going on here, because you're all presenting this as if you're very reasoned and everything. But actually, when you look at what's happening in terms of the dialogue, all we have to do is think about Greta Thunberg. Think about her, 16-year-old kid, scared shitless, who now the whole entire adult society is deferring to, from the Pope to the Archbishop of Canterbury, to the plutocrats of Davos, to the European Parliament, to the UK Parliament. Everybody is looking at her and saying, she's right. She's this prophet. And what's her message? Her message is that we, the older generation, are shit, that we've created this problem, we are the problem, you have taken away my future, and our role as young people is to panic. And I don't really... The problem here is you're setting up such a dialogue, such a rotten assumption, that it robs the potential of anybody looking at the world and looking at themselves as being capable of solving this problem. You're kind of paralyzing the future because you've got a generation of people who believe that they have no responsibility, that the adults have absconded from the room, they've left the building, and that they are somehow going to be left to pick up the can. And all they can think about is, well, we just have to cut back on what we're doing. We have to rein in our ambition. We have to stop the potential of us becoming the problem solvers of the future. And so the message here is really, really backward. It's the most socially backward movement in the history of mankind.
Okay, that's very
because
clear.
You're robbing us.
Thank you. So behind you and then down to the front here, and I'm afraid, I'm really sorry I can't take you again. We've run out of time.
The one thing that keeps coming to mind is how this movement, or how the dealing with the ecological crisis kind of mimics a lot of other big crises, financial crises, or, access to rights that have happened a lot over our history. And it seems to me that generally sweeping change doesn't come from looking across the aisle and blaming immigrants and minorities and women, which is often like an easy scapegoat. And I think that, and my accent gives away the fact that my country has not pulled its weight in this, the States, sorry, in this crisis. But I do think that it really is the responsibility of the state to sort of make good decisions for the environment, and not necessarily on individual young people and women to make those decisions.
This is kind of a strange question given that we're at the battle of ideas, but I think what I wanted to ask is, how has this question even come? Like, why are we having children? I think that just sums up so much about society at the moment. Like, how no one our age can make a simple decision. Like, it is so hard. Like, I remember I was talking to my grandma the other day, and she was like, oh yeah, I took these A levels and then just did this, and no one believed that I would get anything from it, but I did it because I wanted it to. And now in education, it's like, you have to do this to get here, to get here, to get here, because then you need a job. But oh wait, if you get a good job, you can't actually do it because then you're like going to harm the environment by over-consuming. And it's like, everything has been made into a massive thing. And I think that's what the issue of this question is. No one now can think, oh, I want a kid. Can I have a kid? No, that's just not a decision. And I think what my question is why is it all made so complicated? And I think we can look at mass media and be like, oh, it's a good thing, it's getting everything out there. But people are trying to put their point of view, and nothing's corresponding, so no one knows what they think. The state don't know what they think, so they're putting it on young people, and young people don't know what they think, so they're relying on the state to tell them. So it's just getting very confusing how we can fix that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Great point to end on from the floor.
I think it is really, really hard and really confusing, and I think, we're in this position because we've been lied to for a very long time, and ideally, our societies and our authority figures would have acted on the science a long time ago, and we perhaps could have done things in a lot slower way. We wouldn't have had to be so freaked out in so many different ways. We wouldn't have to deal with structural racism across the world and all the kind of issues that we've been trying to deal with for such a long time, at the same time as trying to deal with the climate crisis and all the exacerbating factors that it makes. So it is very hard, but I think we should look at it. And I think that we can try our best and we can live well while we're trying our best. And just because we're consuming less doesn't mean you have to live worse. Just because you're looking at the problem and you're trying to solve it doesn't mean you have to be depressed. Just because you're not having kids doesn't mean you have to be depressed. Even if you have kids, you can live a good life in this period of time. I think a lot of people have made a really great point that life, the value of life is relative. It's relative to how you feel, where you've been brought up, what your experiences are. So I hope that everyone in this room doesn't feel too pressurized when it comes to giving birth, but it just is an issue of our time, and I guess that's what BirthStrike is talking about and bringing to the fore. I'd also recommend that if you've read about us through the media, then you probably it'd be great if you just looked up our website, which is birthstrikeforfuture.com, because it just clears up a lot of the issues that have been talked about in the room, especially yours over there, and links to a lot of really interesting resources. No coercion, just check out the website and make your own decision. Thanks for listening.
Okay. What concerns me is how there's so little pushback against these kinds of ideas. So if you frame this as your understanding of what the system is, you would get pushback, and quite rightly, I think. And if you think it is a systemic problem, then we ought to have a conversation about the system. What exactly is it? How do you understand it? If you think of it as a systemic problem, then the solution is actually technological. The important thing, it's important to realize that the good thing about capitalism is how it freed so many people to consume. That's the good part of capitalism. The fact that it has raised so many people out of poverty. I am immensely freer because I can press a button on a coffee machine and it goes bean to cup. I love this coffee machine. And I don't have to sit. That's something that would have taken such a huge amount of labor in the past. And that frees me to do other things, to think and create and whatever, because I don't have to spend my day toiling away to reproduce my existence. The question is, how do we release this technology, the huge, immense forces of production that human beings could never have dreamed of in the past, and we're using them to churn out little rubber ducks. That is immensely wasteful. That's crazy. We could be using this to create things that are really good for human beings. And so the question is, how do we release that incredible technology and consumption from some of the more destructive forms that it takes? And so if the problem is, how you frame a problem really invites a particular solution. So if the problem is species and so on, then the answer is make less of us, make less of this species. The problem is consumption, consume less. If the problem is systematic, we have to understand exactly what the system is, and we have to decide and figure out whether or not that is the correct understanding of the system, and we need to follow the most progressive parts of that system forward into the future. What is it that's good about this system? And how do we release that from its more destructive effects, and with our eyes always on the future and always on human freedom as an uncompromising goal?
I very much take your point that you made earlier on about difficult choices. The fact is that we are not the last 80,000 years of human history. We're in a place now that we've never been in before. And the choices that we have to make now are all really difficult choices. There are no simple choices. And I wish it hadn't happened to you and your generation, or it wasn't something that's happening to my generation. But let no one be in any doubt about the situation we're in. It doesn't matter what's ever taken place before. The situation we're in now involves us all making choices and changing things. And I go back to what I said earlier on about, you read this word transformation over and over and over again. And we're on a very short timetable to make those transformations. So what we need is the energy and the positivity and the belief that we can do it more than anything. But what we don't want is just to sit around and go, well, is something else going to solve it? We have to solve it ourselves. And going back to, we're talking about birth and we're talking about population here because it's the nature of this debate. There's plenty of other things which we all know that need addressed here. On the population issue, if we can have fewer new people coming onto this planet, it will make it easier for us to solve all our problems. It's pretty much a statement of fact. The way we can do that is by positive means, by empowering people, not by coercing people or anything else. That is part of the solution. But the point is that we need to be focusing on the solution, on the things that we know that we can do. And the recipe is already there. We don't need to look for some new thing. It's there in the IPCC reports. It's there in the IPBES reports. It's there in multiple things that we see. So just quickly, very much emphasising what Blythe said. Please read BirthStrike's website. Please read our website, because there's so much that we haven't been able to touch on here just now. Make yourselves informed. We can make a difference, but we do have to do it now, and we mustn't discount any ethical, positive choice that we can make in whatever form, including about the number of children that we have.
Well, I guess in some ways we've heard the arguments about two different visions of where society is now and two different visions of where society is in the future, and you make your decision about which one you think is the most compelling to you. I mean, what I would say is that no one has got the responsibility to have a child. I don't think anyone's suggesting that you have to have a child. I don't think that's a solution for society. I don't think not having a child is going to be a solution for society. I don't think that the solution lies in decisions that we make about the birth of additions to our families. What I would say is that, and what really worries me, is when we lose the distinction, I think someone was indicating down here, between private decisions and intimate decisions and public and social change decisions. And what I honestly believe is that to get pregnant or to keep a pregnancy when you've got pregnant is one of the most personal and private and intimate decisions that we can take. But every sympathy with those of you who are sort of saying, oh, I don't know really what to do about this, and I don't know how I'll feel about having children. Of course you don't, because it's not a decision that most of us take in the abstract for a whole number of pro and con reasons. Typically what happens is that we decide to have children, or indeed to not continue the pregnancy that we have had unintentionally, according to the circumstances of our lives there and then. And a lot of that is to do with the relationships that you are in at that particular time. And so what I would say is that, you take those decisions according to what you think that you can best do, both for your own life, but also for the world going forward. But basically, hunkering down under the bunker, I don't think is going to bring any solution around at all.
Thank you.